Something happened inside the United States government that should have shaken every newsroom awake because a senior intelligence figure walked away, resigned, and left behind a warning so serious that it exposed how fragile the entire situation had become. The real shock was not only that he resigned, but that the message he left behind pointed to a deeper failure inside American foreign policy, where the public story and the real strategy were no longer lining up, and the gap between them had become impossible to ignore. For years, Washington had operated as if its military dominance in the Middle East was permanent, as if Iran could be pressured indefinitely, and as if the strategic interests of Israel and the United States would always move in perfect alignment. But that assumption is now breaking apart at the core. Before we go any further, I want to say something straight from the heart. Because I work hard to analyze these stories and collect the news carefully, yet many of you still do not like, subscribe, or share. And even though I reply to every comment, the support is still not what it should be, so please follow Market Mindset and also our backup channel, Market Mindset 2, because that support is what keeps this work alive. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to step back and look at the long history behind it, because this did not begin with one speech, one threat, or one sudden warning, but with years of pressure, distrust, sanctions, proxy conflict, and strategic confrontation. The relationship between Washington and Tehran has been shaped for decades by exactly that pattern, and every time the tension seemed to cool, another crisis appeared and pushed both sides back toward the edge. What makes this episode different is that the crisis no longer looks like a temporary flare-up, because the foundations underneath it have started to crack in a way that could reshape the entire regional balance. A senior intelligence official, someone deeply embedded in America's national security structure, resigned from his post, and that alone would have been major news anywhere else in the world. But what made the resignation explosive was the warning that came with it, because he said the war against Iran was not being fought in America's strategic interest, and that the entire operation was being driven by something else entirely. He also said that Iran was not, as publicly claimed, on the verge of building a nuclear weapon, and that the ceasefire now in place was fragile not because of Tehran, but because of the behavior and decisions coming from Israel. That is not a casual comment, because when a man who spent his career inside the machinery of American power issues a warning like that, he is not speaking like a commentator. He is speaking like someone who sees the structure of the problem from the inside. The original public objective was presented as something straightforward: neutralize Iran's nuclear capability, secure the region, and restore stability. But that was only the surface explanation given to the public. Inside the operation, the goal had clearly become much larger and much more dangerous, because what was really being pursued was regime pressure, regional transformation, and the restructuring of the Middle East power map in one sweeping campaign. That kind of campaign does not stay limited for long, because once the objective becomes the weakening of an entire regional power, the conflict stops being about one program or one facility and becomes about survival itself. Iran did not collapse under that pressure, and that failure changed everything, because instead of a clean strategic victory, the result became a costly sequence of military actions that produced damage, loss, and no decisive political outcome. Aircraft were lost, equipment was destroyed, casualties were reported, and the one thing Washington wanted most, a clear and undeniable breakthrough, never arrived. That is where the story takes a sharp turn, because what should have ended in dominance instead moved toward stalemate, and then suddenly the ceasefire entered the picture. Most people misread a ceasefire like this as a pause, a breath, or a tactical reset, but this one was far more important than that, because the terms themselves revealed who actually had leverage. The agreement was not built around American priorities, and it was not structured as a deal where Washington dictated the conditions and Iran simply accepted them under pressure. Instead, the framework reflected Iranian priorities in a very serious way, because regime change was taken off the table, the missile program was excluded from the negotiation agenda, and the structure of the deal protected the core of Iran's strategic position. Even more important, the ceasefire preserved Iranian authority over the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical waterways on Earth, through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves every day. That means the conflict was never just about weapons or speeches, because it was also about geography, energy, and the ability to influence the global economy by controlling a route the entire world depends on. The agreement also pointed towards sanctions relief, returned frozen assets to the conversation, and introduced international guarantors, most notably China, whose presence changes the entire strategic picture going forward. Once China becomes a guarantor, any future American move against Iran is no longer just a bilateral problem, because it becomes a direct challenge to Chinese diplomatic credibility and strategic influence. That is why this ceasefire cannot be described honestly as a simple pause, because it is better understood as a structural realignment that was shaped by the side Washington was supposedly meant to force into surrender. Iran has always used a different kind of strategy because it does not try to outbuild the United States ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft, since that is a competition it cannot win. Instead, Iran builds leverage through networks, proxies, alliances, choke points, and long-term influence, creating pressure points that make any conflict far more expensive for the other side. That is the playbook behind Hezbollah's strength in Lebanon, the Houthi threat in Yemen, and Iranian influence in Iraq, all of which were built slowly and deliberately over many years. Those were not accidents, and they were not improvised reactions, because they were strategic investments designed to make confrontation so costly that even a superpower would have to think twice. The ceasefire terms now visible to the world show that this strategy worked far better than many in Washington wanted to admit. Under the new conditions, sanctions relief means money can begin flowing back into Iran, and frozen assets being returned means liquidity, breathing room, and a stronger economic base than before. And because missile capabilities were excluded from the negotiation framework, Iran can continue developing that part of its strategic arsenal without formal restraint from the ceasefire itself. The longer the ceasefire holds, the more Iran benefits, not because the ceasefire magically strengthens it, but because the arrangement gives it time, space, and financial relief. At the same time, Iranian authority over the Strait of Hormuz remains a major economic lever, and that leverage does not disappear just because the shooting slows down. This is where the next layer of the story becomes impossible to ignore, because the ceasefire does not resolve the Israeli-Iranian conflict. It merely suspends it, and a suspended conflict can still explode at any moment. Inside Israel, the reaction has been intense, because senior political figures and opposition leaders have described the outcome in language that sounds much closer to strategic defeat than to victory. Their argument is blunt. The campaign failed to achieve its main objectives. Iran was not seriously degraded, the threat was not neutralized, and the resources committed did not produce a matching return. That matters because when even political opponents within a country begin using that kind of language, it usually means the strategic damage is real and not just a matter of public relations. The bigger problem is that the United States and Israel are not operating on the same timeline or the same strategic interests right now, and that creates tension inside the alliance itself. America wants stability because another escalation cycle would be costly at home, politically dangerous, and economically disruptive at a time when domestic pressure is already heavy. Israel, from its own perspective, sees the ceasefire very differently because if Iran gains sanctions relief, retains missile power, and keeps its regional leverage, then the balance of power shifts in a direction Israel does not want. That creates a dangerous mismatch, because when allies begin pulling in opposite directions, the alliance stops being a source of strength and starts becoming a source of friction. The intelligence official who resigned understood that risk very clearly, and his warning was aimed directly at the possibility that actions taken by one side of the alliance could destroy the fragile ceasefire for everyone. Beneath the political language and the diplomatic headlines, there are real economic consequences that ordinary people feel very quickly whenever this region becomes unstable. Oil prices, shipping costs, insurance rates, supply chains, and broader market confidence all react to tension around the Strait of Hormuz, and those effects reach families and businesses far beyond the Middle East. Every rise in energy prices is felt by workers, consumers, and small businesses in places that may seem far away from the crisis, but are still financially connected to it through the global economy. That is why this issue is not just about military planning or political messaging, because the costs travel fast and land directly on ordinary people. The political stakes are just as serious, because an administration that promised one outcome and delivered another has to answer for the gap between the public narrative and the actual result. That gap does not vanish just because the fighting pauses. And for America's regional partners in the Gulf, the outcome forces a difficult reassessment of what American backing really guarantees. If a coalition built around pressure on Iran fails to produce the promised results, every partner involved eventually starts asking whether the strategy is still working at all. That question matters because alliances survive on trust, and trust weakens quickly when the outcome looks very different from the one that was promised at the beginning. The next 30 to 90 days are going to matter a great deal because this ceasefire could either become a real opening or the quiet beginning of the next, more dangerous phase. If the ceasefire holds, then negotiations may move forward, sanctions could ease, and a new regional balance may slowly emerge over time. But that same process would also give Iran more room to grow stronger. If the ceasefire breaks, especially through an incident outside the normal diplomatic framework, then escalation could return instantly, and the whole region could be pulled back toward confrontation. If internal pressure inside the United States grows, then policy could shift again with very little warning, and that kind of instability would leave allies and adversaries equally uncertain about what happens next. That is the real lesson here, because the United States no longer moves in a world where its threats exist without credible counterpressure, and that changes every calculation in the Middle East. Russia, China, and the wider multipolar environment all matter now in ways that would have been dismissed more easily in the past, but can no longer be ignored. The old assumption that one power can dictate the outcome of every major crisis is fading, and this episode is one of the clearest signs that the New World Order is already taking shape. That is why this story matters so much, because what happened here was not just a ceasefire, it was a warning about how fast global power can shift when the balance is no longer one-sided. If this breakdown helped you understand the bigger picture, then like this video, share it with someone who follows world events, comment your opinion below, and subscribe to Market Mindset for more strong, deep, and clear analysis.